Welcome everyone to NSTA Web Seminars, where you can find live interactive learning at your desktop. Tonight's presentation is titled Using the Next Generation Science Standards Practices in the Elementary Grades. Our presenters today are Heidi Schweingruber, Deborah Smith, and Jessica Jeffries. We also have Ted Willard online with us, NSTA's Director of Efforts around the Next Generation Science Standards. My name is Bryn Slate. I will be moderating the program, and we have Jeff Lehman online with us to answer your technical questions. Before we get started, I wanted to remind everyone to visit the NSTA Learning Center. It's your online portal for over 10,400 resources for science educators, and we're adding resources all the time. Over 3,500 of those resources are free for anyone to access, and you can add them to your library so you can get to those when it's convenient for you. Our community forums are available for you to discuss with other science teachers the issues that are important to your classroom. We have online advisors who are available via our live support button, who are ready to help you find what you're looking for there in the Learning Center. And that includes our free tools, which are available to help you organize your professional learning, to document what you're doing, and then to meet your goals. And it's all available by going to learningcenter.nsta.org. And now I'd like to introduce today's presenters. First off, we have Ted Willard. He's the Director of NSTA's efforts around the Next Generation Science Standards, and he'll be starting us off with a review on the development of NGSS. Then we'll get into our featured presenters, and Heidi Schweingruber from the National Research Council is going to start us off. And then Deborah Smith from Penn State University and Jessica Jeffries, who is with the State College Area School District, will be providing some information on using the practices in the classroom. So I wanted to welcome the presenters, and at this point I'm going to turn it over to Ted Willard to get us started. Welcome, Ted.
Thanks there, Bryn. Happy to see everyone here. Another great number of educators coming out for this series here. This is in some ways a follow-up, a set of web seminars we're doing this January, following up the set on the practices we did, and I'm going to give sort of an overview of the Next Generation Science Standards and the elements involved here. The standards themselves were developed with 4 organizations being made use working. The National Academies, which Heidi can tell us a great deal about, she's from there. Achieve, NSTA, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And so there's a two-step process here in this development going on. We start off with the framework for K-12 science education, which if you are not familiar with, I strongly recommend you take a look at it. We'll give you some sense of that. You can get a free PDF from the National Academies Press website. You can also order it via NSTA Press. Those of you who are on our website, the Science Store. And there are 3 dimensions to the framework that are important to understand: scientific and engineering practices, cross-cutting concepts, and disciplinary core ideas. I'll give you some examples of those. The scientific and engineering practices, what we're going to be talking about today and how they apply to the elementary grades, is this set of ideas, pieces here. Yeah, from asking questions and defining problems for engineering, you can see planning and carrying out investigations, constructing explanations, engaging in argument from evidence. That whole set there are the practices. The cross-cutting concepts, the list of 7 that I have here, things like patterns, scale, structure, and function, things that cut across all the various disciplines in science. And then we have the disciplinary core ideas, the content, if you will, in place here. The life science, physical science, earth and space science, and engineering and technology, which has been sort of incorporated into science as well. Each of these areas breaks down into 4 farther sections and even down into more detailed sections beyond that. And so that is the element in terms of the framework, of defining these elements. And then comes the process of developing the standards themselves, or achieve, working with a set of 26 states outlined in blue here, has been drivers behind that. Now, the states that are in blue here have been involved in the development of the standards. They've had teams that have been reviewing various drafts as they've come into play, and they've promised to seriously consider adopting the standards once they are completed. Now, for those of you who are not in one of those states, if you're in a gray state, those states will have the option to adopt the standards as well as soon as they are completed. And I know there are several of these states in here that are looking strongly at doing that once everything is done. So what we have in place here is, with these standards, assessments, curriculum, instruction, and teacher development will all flow out of the design of these standards. So let's take a closer look at some of these pieces here. The second and final draft is out right now. It is going to be done, as you can see, January 29th. Tonight is the last night, so after the web seminar. Make sure you stay for this whole web seminar. But after that, if you haven't, I suggest you go and take a look at the standards. I'm putting out a link that gives you a link to the standards when you want to take a look at them. I also can give you later some resources the NSTA has around that. The final draft of the standards is expected by the end of March, and so we'll be all looking eagerly at that point. So here's a performance expectation, sort of piece of the standards here. You can see those scientific and engineering practices, those core ideas and cross-cutting concepts shown here in this box, and this is known as the foundation box. And so then we have this idea here, up here, or this performance expectation, I should call it, developing molecular models of reactants and products to support the explanation that atoms and therefore mass are conserved in a chemical reaction. So that is meant to combine the different elements here. It takes pieces in blue here are considered part of the scientific and engineering practice, developing molecular models. The pieces in orange are the disciplinary core ideas and how they are reflected in the standards. And then the cross-cutting concepts are represented in the green. I want to point out that these performance expectations are trying to describe what will be assessed. They aren't specifying here what specifically should be taught as a lesson. So just because this says develop molecular models doesn't mean that that's the sole activity that would take into place in a classroom. You would be focusing on these concepts using a number of different practices, and I think we'll hear some more about that a little later, to get students to the point where at the end of instruction they would be able to carry out a task that was probing this performance expectation. And so with that in place, I'm going to pass things over to Heidi so she can give you some more details about the practices.
Terrific. Thanks, Ted. I assume that I correctly turned on my talk button. Is that right?
You have.
Yes, we can hear you. It's really great to have a chance to talk with so many people, even virtually. Thanks for taking the time out of your evening to join us. We have 3 presenters today. I'm from the National Research Council, and I co-directed the study that produced the framework, which, as Ted explained, is the first phase towards these next generation science standards. Deb Smith, who's at Penn State University, is actually on that committee. So she was a representative on the committee that produced the framework, and then Jessica Jeffries is a teacher who's been working with Deb, and she works in State College. And so I'm going to give, in my section of the presentation, some of the main points from the background research related to young children's learning that really underpin the push in the framework for having students begin engaging in science practices starting at the very beginning of elementary school. And then Deb and Jess are going to take us kind of into the classroom so you can actually see these practices in action and the ways that kids actually are able to engage with them when you have carefully designed instruction. So we wanted to first get a sense of the audience, so now you get to put that practice with clip art into play. So first we wanted to get a sense of the range of grades that people are teaching. So I think you'd use your clip art to put it in the right space here.
Thanks, Heidi. And folks, if you were with us for the practice, you know what to do. You'll select the clip art from that bottom button. If you joined us after we got warmed up a little bit, you'll be using the toolbar that is alongside your participants window, and using the bottom button there that looks like a mountain with the sun over it to pick a piece of clip art under common symbols to put in your grade. And if you are happen to be teaching across grades or in multiple categories, you can certainly put a stamp in multiple boxes. But Heidi, it looks like across the board here, but a number of folks there who aren't in the classroom, which we saw in the beginning. We had a number of principals, curriculum coordinators, university faculty, and others who are going to be in that bottom box.
Right. No, this is very helpful. It's very good to see the spread. I think all three of us are glad to see such a spread, but I also know there's a number who aren't currently teaching. Great. Now, one more question, just trying to get some sense of familiarity with these practices. Now, I know a number of people had actually indicated they hadn't participated in previous webinars, but you still might have already taken a look at these documents and know something about the practices already. And so this is just on a 1 to 5 scale where 1 is not at all familiar. How familiar do you feel like you are with the practices already?
Okay, everyone, and your clip art is active once again, and I'll just ask everyone if you can try to work on putting your clip art above the line so that we can still see the labels underneath. I know it's hard with so many people in the room. We've got an awesome number of around 275 and 260 in the room with us. So thank you so much, and I see lots of you responding to my request to move it above the line. So, and again, Heidi, it looks like quite a spread across the line there.
Right. So that's great. We're going to try to keep that in mind as we move forward. And I would also encourage those who aren't familiar. I think in this presentation you're not going to get incredibly deep dives in each practice, and so the previous webinars from the NST I think are really helpful, particularly for those who get intrigued by or still have some questions about going back to those previous webinars. Could be really helpful for understanding them a bit more. So thank you guys for that. And I'm now going to move into the meat of my section, and what I'm going to talk about in this first sort of stage setting is really focusing on a subset of the guiding assumptions for the framework. So there are a number of assumptions about science learning and teaching that really are the foundation for the framework, and those come out of decades of research on learning and teaching in science that actually we summarized at in my shop, the Board on Science Education, in some previous reports. But then they have guided what happened in the framework. And I'm going to focus on 4 that are really the most relevant for engaging elementary kids in the practices. And that are the children are born investigators, this notion that kids are competent from the beginning, curious, and do a lot to try to understand their world. Second, that there's a focus on a core set of ideas and practices, and that means trying to narrow a bit what you're focusing on, highlighting the most important ideas as well as the most important things that scientists and engineers do, which is basically what we mean by practices. Next, we have this notion that understanding develops over time, so attention to systematic building of both an understanding of ideas and being able to engage in the practices. That you expect that that's going to happen across time, and so you want to try to be coherent from grade to grade and not be scattershot in how you're treating engagement in an idea or engaging in a practice. And finally, really pushing hard on the notion that science and engineering require both knowledge and practice. So it's not just about memorizing facts. It's also not just about sort of random exploration. It's really a joining of knowledge with systematic practice. So I'm going to sort of unpack a little bit the research behind those 4 assumptions. So I want to start with this notion of young children's competence. And this really is an incredibly important point, and is part of the push for bringing in the framework and the standards science to the elementary grades starting in kindergarten. That is that kids starting school are really very competent, and they have a substantial knowledge of the natural world. So they do a lot to try to understand the world around them and engage with it. They're not concrete and simplistic thinkers. So sometimes interpretations of Piagetian theory of child development led people to think that before a certain age, kids were really concrete, and something like science was way beyond them and very, very difficult. And so recent work, more recent work in developmental psychology over the past 20 or 30 years has sort of upended that notion that before a certain age kids can't think more abstractly, and has really shown ways that they're incredibly sophisticated to a certain extent. And that really that's the stepping off point for scientific thinking. But instruction needs to harness these things that kids come with and really build on the foundation. So unpacking this idea, what do I mean by children's reasoning being pretty sophisticated? They actually can think in sophisticated and abstract ways. So some examples, and this comes from research literature, and the striking thing is you see some similar kinds of trends across different kids from different backgrounds, different cultures, kids in different countries. Very early on, before they even start school, they distinguish living from non-living. They recognize, for example, animate motion, how living things move in animate motion. They know that things in the physical world, like one object hitting another, is a different cause than in the social world, where one person whispering to another might cause something. And they also know that people's beliefs aren't an exact representation of the external world, and that may not seem immediately relevant to how we think about science and science in school, but when you think about needing to test your ideas against other people's ideas, or needing to understand that what you think is going on with the phenomena could be wrong because it's not an exact representation of the world, those are important insights. And this actually emerges somewhat around 3 or 4, and you can see it when kids start to lie. Then you know that they're starting to understand this idea that people don't necessarily have an exact understanding of the real world. So to illustrate a little further, once kids categorize something into a living thing or a non-living thing, they then think differently about those two categories. So for example, they know that it's okay for a non-living thing like a hammer to say, what's the purpose of a hammer? They know it's kind of weird and not really appropriate to ask the purpose of a whole living thing, like you wouldn't ask the purpose of a tiger. But they also know that you can ask the purpose of the parts of that tiger. So they reason differently once they put these things in these two categories. Another example, if you give them a bird and a fish and then give them a new thing and tell them it's a bird, they know that that shares more similarities with the bird than it does with the fish. So they use their knowledge of the natural world to make these sort of sophisticated leaps in reasoning. Another example, this time where kids have the ability to do it, but practice and instructional support are also key, is they can actually learn how to control variables. So an example of this was actually done in a study where researchers had a group of adults and a group of kids, each of whom were trying to understand the relationship between two variables. And they were supposed to do a series of trials and then figure out what the relationship between the variables was. Well, the adults blew the kids out of the water in the initial round, but then the experimenters noticed that the adults were actually making consistent and very careful notes about the results of each trial, whereas the kids were just kind of doing them, looking at what happened, and not taking consistent notes and really tracking. They either thought they would remember or they didn't understand that the trials might be useful to track. So when the experimenters showed the students how to make systematic notes and explained that it was important to look from trial to trial, the kids' performance then became better. It wasn't on par with the adults, but it was much, much better, thereby indicating the kids could do the reasoning, but they didn't also have the tools to understand what they needed to support their own reasoning. So that's where practice and instructional support are really key. But it's not that kids can't do it. So I'm often asked when I give this talk or talk about these issues is, okay, well, if kids come with so much capability, then why can't we just teach calculus in kindergarten? And the notion is because even though kids have a lot of competence and you can build on that competence, there are also constraints on their reasoning. And I've just highlighted some of them here, and I think for those of you who've worked with young children, you probably will understand these in a very practical sense. So first is children are universal novices. So adults often in new learning situations will learn by analogy to situations they're more familiar with. But kids they're still learning about almost everything. And so they are really what we call universal novices. They don't have as many things to compare to and use to leverage in their analogy. So we have to introduce them and support them in more things. Also the nature of the task. So much of the knowledge that kids come to school with we would call implicit, meaning they kind of know it and they can use it, but if you ask them specifically, do you understand this? Tell me what you know, they wouldn't be able to do it. So the nature of the task really matters for what you're going to see in terms of what kids are showing they know and can do. And so really thinking about one of the things we're doing in science education is helping kids go from this implicit knowledge to helping them make their knowledge more explicit, helping them understand what they understand, etc. And finally, connected to that is awareness of their own thinking, which is also called metacognition. And probably many of you have heard about this and even think about strategies for supporting this in your classrooms. And that is helping kids understand not just what they know and whether they have a good understanding and what else they need to learn, but also sort of tracking their own learning and knowing how to support their own learning. So for example, the notion that when you taught kids to take notes on different trials in an experiment, in part you were helping them understand, you can't remember all the trials. That's an awareness of the limits of their own memory. And so you need to make notes on each of the trials. And so those are just some of the constraints that we need to think about in terms of both trying to build on these strong foundation kids come with, but knowing that they're going to need our help in moving forward, and we have to be thoughtful in the support that we're providing. So this introduces one of the ideas behind practices. So I like to say that practices, scientific and engineering practices, are kind of a twofer. So I think you get two things when you engage kids in them. First, you're getting them to do the things that scientists and engineers do at the level that they can handle them. But also the practices themselves and engaging in the practices leverages kids' learning of the ideas in science that you want them to come to understand, because they provide these opportunities for reflection and consolidation of understanding. So the practices both engage them in science and engineering to learn about the science and engineering, but they leverage what they're coming to understand about explanations in science. So it's this really lovely twofer. You get a dual benefit for having kids engage in practices. So I wanted to backtrack a little bit. One of the things we're using practices to do is build conceptual knowledge. So this is one of the major shifts that the framework and the NGSS are moving toward, is trying to move away from having kids learn sort of discrete, disconnected facts, which some people I've worked with have called the accretion model of science. So it's like a snowball just rolling down a hill and you just stick facts on, and once you get a big snowball, kids understand. We now know that's not really how you come to be more expert in science, that you're building basically a structure so you understand how ideas in a discipline are related to each other. So that understanding is going to be constructed on what kids bring. And we know that they bring some great starting points. We also know they bring what some people have called misconceptions, understandings of the world that definitely don't agree with scientific understanding and explanation. But we need to find those good starting points for them. And then we have to help them build this sort of structure of knowledge, and that's going to require some conceptual change, some change in their understanding, some change in the way their knowledge is structured, and it's going to require intentional effort and support, because we know some of these ideas in science are difficult. Understanding atomic molecular theory eventually, or genetics, took human beings a really long time, and kids aren't going to get that on their own without support. So in terms of thinking about this conceptual understanding of what I mean by building a framework for your ideas, an analogy that I've found useful is to think about a map and how a map works for helping you navigate a terrain. So this is a map of Washington, D.C. If I was visiting and I wanted to get from the Capitol to the White House, I could have a friend just tell me the list of directions, and then I could memorize it. Go across the mall and then go north. But the problem is, if I ran into an obstruction, if there was construction or a motorcade or something, a protest, I would have no idea how to go a different way to get to the same place. But if I was given a map, or at least a rough lay of the land, I could think of alternate routes. I would have more power in how I thought about getting from one place to another. And thinking about these, what we mean by conceptual framework, this is kind of a good analogy. So if you have this map of how ideas in an explanation in science are related to each other, you have a lot more power in thinking about problems and approaching experiments and things like that. You just have a lot more power in your thinking, and you can leverage the future learning that you do more effectively. When we talk about conceptual change, you might think about, so for example, I grew up in Chicago, so my mental map of a city is the body of water is in the east, and the streets are a grid. But if I moved to the West Coast, that mental map that I have of how the world works would fall apart. If I tried to assume that the body of water was still in the east, I would be lost because the Pacific Ocean is actually in the west. So I would have to change my mental map. I would have to undergo conceptual change to understand navigating on the West Coast. A more profound conceptual change might be if I went to San Francisco. In Chicago, things are pretty flat. In San Francisco, suddenly, things are also in 3D. I've got hills and stairs, and I need to figure out how to navigate that. Well, I have to make an even more extreme conceptual change or shifting of my map to be able to handle navigating in San Francisco. And so I would claim that the kind of conceptual change we're going for kids when they start the beginning of elementary school and are moving across multiple grades through middle school into high school is we're getting them to move from Chicago to San Francisco. So we're doing multiple changes in their internal map that have to take on even whole new dimensions like elevation gain. So this kind of change takes an awful lot of time, and that's why the framework and standards are built over multiple grades, looking for coherence across the grades, and the practices are a critical part of building that understanding. Because as students work on them, it forces them to synthesize ideas, test their own understanding, develop more awareness of what they don't understand, and the practices are really the way to do that. So these are the practices. There are 8. I should point out that the numbers are for convenience sake only, and it's not like a 5-step you do this first, then that first. We think it's really more iterative when scientists and engineers use these practices. They might engage in asking a question, then they might argue about evidence they already know about. So they might go back and forth between these in different ways, depending on the problem, depending on the stage of how they're thinking about the problem. Some of these you'll see and think, oh, I know, I already do this in my classroom, but others may be things that you haven't done and that will be challenging to think about how to incorporate them. Some that we often don't see in classrooms are really deep use of developing and using models. Engaging in argument from evidence is another one. And Deb and Jess are going to talk about a range of these as they move into giving you concrete examples in the classroom. Again, just to repeat some of the ways that these practices support learning. So we want kids to engage in these practices because they are what scientists and engineers do. So we want them to be able to approximate these in a kid way and learn about science through engaging in practices. But they're also going to leverage their understanding of the ideas in science. So they provide opportunities for reflection, they promote metacognition, and they help students take control of their own learning. So I wanted to pause here and have you think about what we've just talked about, both kids' capabilities, the set of practices that are presented in the framework and the NGSS, and then reflecting on your own experiences working with kids, and select which of these answers best describes how you're currently thinking about the practices. And this is one of those polls I think, Bryn, you're going to help me.
Yes, I will. And everyone, your poll buttons are now active. If you joined us for the warm-up, then you'll know that those are located under your name, and you can select A through D. If you came in a little bit later and need some help finding where those poll buttons are, look at the top of the participants window, find your own name there in bold, and you'll see that the rightmost button has a little A on it. If you mouse over that, you can check A through D. and to give us an idea of how you're thinking about the practices so far. We'll give just another moment or two for everyone to submit their response. I see a few folks have typed there in the chat window, and if you could also just select an answer on the polling buttons as well, then we'll get your answer counted in our total here. We'll be closing the poll in just another moment and then putting up a graph of the responses so that everyone can see the total results and that Heidi can discuss what we have here. I'll go ahead and lock the poll now and put up our graph and just move it down a little bit. And Heidi, I will turn it back to you now to discuss.
Okay, great. So it looks like you bought either you have some experience here, or you kind of bought my argument that kids come in with a lot of capabilities, but they need support to really fully engage. I think C kind of captures that notion, and that's where we saw the bulk of responses. But I do think it's reasonable to also feel like, some of these really are difficult, and it might be tough to imagine how all kids can successfully engage in them. So one of the things that I think Deb and Jess and I hope is that going through the more specific examples in the next part of the presentation will, folks who answered C, I hope that it will help illuminate what some of that guidance can look like that you might give. And for folks who are in A and B, hopefully it'll start to open up some different ideas about what kids can actually do when they're asked to engage in the practices. And so I want to end with the notion that through getting the kids to engage in these practices, to really be sharing with each other through these practices, in a sense, you're creating a scientific community in the classroom. So that doesn't mean that we expect them to act like professional scientists. Totally understand that they're not there yet, but the notion that you're building a community where they're going to exchange ideas with guidance, but they're going to learn to kind of build knowledge in a way similar to how scientists build knowledge and engineers test ideas and designs. So with that, we're going to get into a question period, and I haven't tracked the time, so Ted, hopefully you'll help me track the time on the question session.
Heidi, you're actually in really good shape in terms of time, and before we jump into everyone's question, I just wanted to provide a few reminders. If you need to turn off those notifications, you can follow the steps there. If you want to minimize or expand your chat panel, check out the second set of bullets. And also, I'll remind everyone that you can continue the discussion there in the community forums. We have a special forum set up for NGSS and encourage you to check that out. So at this point, I will go ahead and turn it over to Ted Willard to pull out some of the questions that people may have submitted. If you have one that you're currently thinking of, go ahead and type that into our chat window now, and we'll spend just a few minutes having Heidi respond to those.
Great, thanks Bryn. Thanks Heidi for that beginning piece. We've got a question here from Nancy asking, can you address why the emphasis in physical science for K1 is so focused on, well, let's see here. This actually is, and this is actually not so much specifically on the practices, but the issue of what basically comes into, what is and what is not engaging for young learners, and how, and in what ways can the practices revolve around that?
I think, Ted, I'm not sure I completely understand your question.
Let me try again a second. Is basically, I think the comment here was having something to do with looking at particular topics in the standards and the core ideas, and wondering about what are topics that are interesting to young learners, what are topics that are not as interesting. Of course, we're sort of asking, for some guidance in that. And then basically I'm wondering to what extent to sort of give that more of a practices spin about that. What practices are students typically finding interest in engaging in quickly, and what practices sometimes they may be encouraged to get involved in, or is it the same across the board?
Okay. I also saw a couple questions here that I can do some quick clarification of, I think, while I'm answering this question. So in the NGSS, the performance expectations actually join a practice, join practice and core idea. So in the actual standards, when you look at them, you'll see that pulled together. The notion with the practices is that really kids can engage in all of them and should be encouraged to engage in all of them. Some that may require additional support to have them engage in a scientific way, for example, arguing from evidence and coming to understand what it means to use evidence in your argument, partly because of the lay understanding of what arguing means. It's not yelling at each other or intimidating each other so that one person ends up winning. That's not really what goes on in scientific argumentation. So that's one that can require some additional guidance. But really the notion is, and I saw one comment in the chat box that I think was right, which is saying the way they're written, just as a list, and then even how they're described in the framework, I think, doesn't necessarily capture the way they can be brought into a classroom at the elementary level, where it's still a scientific practice of asking questions or developing arguments, but it's appropriate for kids of that age group. And so it does require some thinking through, and that is some of what they've tried to do in the translation from the framework to the NGSS, is make some of that translation.
Yeah, I think just to add on to that, I know one of the things that the framework presented some progressions but didn't assign it to particular grade ranges. I'm assuming one of the reasons for that ultimately comes down to historically there hasn't been a lot of engaging elementary students in the practices, and so for a middle school student or a fourth or fifth grader, it may be that this is a new way for them to engage, and it may be difficult if they haven't had that experience in earlier grades. But down the road, as NGSS becomes implemented, we may be seeing more cases of third, fourth, and fifth graders being very facile with the practices. Would you expect something like that?
Possibly. I mean, I actually think for younger students who may not have had a lot of science, engaging in the practices from the beginning will actually be attractive in a way, because it's really asking them to engage their minds and interact with each other. For students in upper elementary, possibly middle school, one issue may be if there's been a kind of instruction that focuses more on learning facts, they may have some time where they have to shift gears to understanding now, no, that's actually not really what science is. That was what science was in school, and we're now shifting you more toward a better approximation of the scientific process. And so they may have to both learn not to do what was successful in science before and learn to engage in the practices. But I actually think engaging in the practices with support is very rewarding, and kids will come to find it a better way to do science and find it more exciting.
Great. Let's take another question here. The students seem to really enjoy science, specifically the experiments that go hand in hand with each other's lesson. However, we hardly have any time to dedicate every day to science. My question is, with the short amount of time we have at the end of the day, how do we make science most beneficial to our students?
So on a very specific level, I actually think Deb and Jess's discussion will help address this in terms of the particulars of day-to-day instruction. In terms of the whole structure of the framework and the NGSS, the notion that we've tried to target a core set of ideas and this core set of practices and then have kids revisit it each year in greater depth partly goes to this notion that having kids not be scattershot in the ideas they're trying to build is really the way to make it most beneficial. So that when you have a short amount of time, you know the biggest bang for your buck ideas and practices to get those kids working on and working with that's going to help them build toward what they're going to be learning in the later grades. So that's the whole structure of the framework, and NGSS is partly trying to do that.
Great, thanks, Heidi. Why don't we go on a little bit to Deb and Jess's pieces here, so that we can see some of their examples, and then we can move on to some questions after they've had a chance to share their pieces.
Great.
And so everyone, I think we've got Deb and Jess on the phone, and we're going to tell us when you want your slides advanced.
Okay.
So I'll be happy to take care of that, or Brynwell will make sure that it gets done.
Okay, thanks, Ted. I'm Deb Smith.
I'm Jess Jeffries.
And we worked together in Jessica's kindergarten classroom because we were interested in trying out some of these ideas. I was an advisor to Taking Science to School and a collaborator on Ready, Set, Science, and I was on the framework committee. And there's really very little in-depth classroom research about what actually happens when little kids try these things out. And Jessica we were working in Jessica's kindergarten classroom, and a colleague had suggested Jessica to me and said she'd be wonderful to work with, and she was. And so we want to show you some things that happened in her classroom and hope that you can get a sense of the real excitement and engagement that kindergarten children had in using these science practices. And Jess is going to talk a bit about the classroom and what was going on.
So when I kind of met up with Deb, I was very interested to know more about that piece of including some of those practices into my classroom. And up until this point, up until the point where I was with Deb, we were doing a lot of kind of your, I guess, typical science. And we had just finished, I had an intern, and she was doing a plant unit where we were following some of our activities that we had done in the past, which required a lot of just basically stating facts and the kids remembering what the facts were, like what is this part of the plant, and they might make a neat or a cute little flower and label it. And that was kind of what science was to me at that point, but I knew that I knew that it could be much more, so I was really excited to have Deb kind of come in and help me too learn how to incorporate that. So we had 23 kids in the class, and we had incorporated things like science notebooks where they were doing a little bit of observing what they were seeing happening as part of my intern's beginning work with plants. But as far as we didn't really have a lot of science talk going on or a lot of science conferences, and that's kind of what we're going to try to show you today as to how that kind of took it to the next level.
So one of the things, if you see this next slide called Environment for Learning, Taking Science for School did a great job of putting this big idea out there. And the big idea is that we think about the classroom as a place where it's not just scientific thinking or scientific tasks, so that it's embedded in the community, and that people are using the talk and the tools and the representations to further their understanding. And so we wanted to explore that. And if you look at the next slide, Jessica's going to talk about how we started out.
Sure. So I think the big thing, and I was listening to some of the comments and ideas from Heidi and everybody, that whole idea of kids needing support on how to do this, I think it's important too to know that teachers need support. And I know that because this was such a new idea for me, knowing how to take what I knew we needed to cover with our standards and our district's curriculum, but yet start to implement some of these other ideas with asking questions and going into some of those other science practices, it was really helpful and necessary for me to have Deb there, and we did a lot of work together. You want to kind of add to that?
Yeah, I'm not sure people can see what's on the plate in this slide, but there are lots of little objects, some of which are seeds and some of which are rocks and shells and other obscure objects. And we had asked the kids to tell us which of these things they thought were seeds. And what we learned from asking was that their notion of what made something a seed, and we'll get to that in a minute, was quite different from the scientific view, which is about structure function and what's inside the seed and how the different parts help the seed to grow. So that's what we're looking at here. We're looking at what the kids were telling us when we talked to them about the different objects. And we'll go on to show you some of their ideas about that. This next slide comes from the NGSS, and we bolded some things that we were aiming at. The kids had already done what's a stem, what's a root, what comes first, what comes second. We wanted to really engage them in drawing and measuring and writing about what the plants needed to live and grow, and then to describe the patterns that they found as they planted and measured and watched things over time. So this NGSS big idea is about structure function, and as Jessica talked about, they already knew the external parts of the plants and what they did, except for leaves and photosynthesis, which was obviously too hard. So we decided to try and move their thinking through evidence into thinking about what the structure and function of a seed was and how that defines a seed, not just its appearance. So in the next slide, Jessica's going to talk about the kinds of questions that we and the kids were asking.
Okay, so I think too the biggest thing was thinking about that how. In the past, I would spend a lot of time with my kids about, having them cut and paste the different parts of a seed and what was happening inside, but we never really talked about how. So that's where hearing some of these questions that they were doing and coming up with, and we just basically asked them, well, why do you think it's a seed and how, and can you tell us a little bit more, and then knowing where to go with that. And my comfort level in doing this with science was very, I guess I should say, uncomfortable. But after I started doing it, I realized that I was doing a lot of this similar kind of practice with our math. We had a very conceptual-based math program, and a lot of what we did was incorporating math talks and getting them to explain how. So kind of thinking about that helped, I think, my kids be comfortable with knowing how to continue that kind of questioning and that kind of format when we had our science conferences, because we had done some with our math. And like I had said before, we were incorporating lots of things with literacy, like during our writer's workshop time, thinking about how maybe their science notebooks could be part of that time instead of just the narrative stories that we might have been working on. So how we could kind of, I think there was a question too about how to fit some of this into your day. That was something too that I kind of realized, is that it doesn't necessarily always need to happen at that same science time, but we started to do some of this during writer's workshop. They would pull out their science notebooks and do some recording on certain days of the week to help with that as well.
Yeah. So in the next slide, you can see some of the ideas that kids told us about what made something a seed. So they thought it had to do with the color, whether it was black, whether it was soft or hard, whether it was smooth. Kids looked at the corn and said, "Oh, it smells like popcorn. I bet it's a corn seed." And sometimes they would comment on another child saying, "Oh, well, I planted that lima bean at my school and it grew, so I think it's a seed." And you can see some of the ideas. It looks like a brush. So the marigold had these little tufts out the end, and they decided it could not be a seed because it looked like a brush. So it was very much focused on the external properties of the object. And so we started with the question about not only what is a seed, but how do we know? How would we find out? And what evidence would we need?
And that was kind of what was new for me as far as this taking this step, is getting them to take these questions and then on their own come up with us kind of supporting them through their conversation. How would we test that in that piece of evidence, which, like I said before, was different than the approach I had tried before.
So given that we had this question, and the kids had lots of questions about how we could find out, in the next slide, we have from the MGSS the practice of planning and carrying out investigations. And there are 3 different things here that we could bring up with kids. And so we wanted them to come up with a way to find out with our support, to make observations and gather evidence, and then to make predictions based on what they already thought and what they had experienced before, and then to come up with more questions. So in this slide, how could we find out? We had 3 children who came up with ways that we could try it out, and I'll let Jessica talk about that.
Well, you can see by what they're saying is this conversation, and again I'm going to just keep reiterating how giving them the chance to talk about this, they came up with these ideas on their own, and meanwhile Deb and I had planned ahead of time knowing that we wanted them to get to this decision, and we could kind of scaffold what that would look like, but they would say we can plant it, we can put it in water, it will grow, and then after 4 months, if it doesn't grow, then it probably isn't a seed. And it was very natural for them to kind of talk through this and know how to solve it, and we were constantly relating that back to what you're doing right now is what scientists do, kind of getting that community established where if you think you would like to say something is true, that this is a seed, then you need to make sure that you've done some kind of an investigation and have collected enough evidence to prove that. And we started that through some of our science talks.
So in this slide, which is Bettina's writing about a particular object, and we hadn't decided because we didn't have any evidence yet, so we had numbers for the different objects, and this one happened to be a sunflower. And Bettina wrote, yes, this is a seed because I know that it is at my house. So we wanted children to bring in their prior knowledge, what had happened in their personal lives and family lives, as well as what has happened in school. And we encouraged kids to talk about all of that information that they had. And this shows you a page from her notebook where kids made predictions and gave their reasons for why they thought that. You will also see further on that they are recording their data, and they use these notebooks in the science conferences to share their ideas and their pictures and their measurements in the science talks. And we especially wanted them to take ownership of the notebooks and of the science talks. So in this slide about analyzing and interpreting data, you can see several examples from NGSS, and these are the kinds of things that we wanted to engage children in. We wanted them not only to draw and write and measure, but to notice patterns and relationships. And they were collecting and representing the data. We were guiding and supporting and sort of making a pathway for them using their ideas and using the ways that they wanted to test things. That doesn't mean we didn't suggest ways, it just means that we were encouraging them to think of their own ways to test things.
And on the next slide, you'll see another example of a type of notebook observation that the students were making. This particular little girl had chosen to test 2 different items or objects, and these were labeled with letters, as you can see. And so she is noticing that number B is growing and the seed is on top of it. So obviously here we're looking for them to be labeling. We were looking for them to make sure they were including those details, like which object they were looking at. And then, like Deb had said earlier, anytime they did a notebook observation like this, they would bring that to the science conference and share that, and therefore they were hearing everybody's different ideas. And if someone else had planted B and had seen that it was growing with the seed on top of it, then they were starting to see some of those patterns.
So this is just another, this next slide is the whole class scientific notebook. Each child had their own notebook. And then we had a whole class scientific notebook for a whole class garden that we were growing. And you can see that kids were, each kid took a turn, and if it was that person's turn, they would do the drawing, do the measurement. You can see the centimeter cubes there. And they would record how much it had grown since the day before. And the evidence, I'm not sure you can see it, but on the right-hand side, this child has written, because there are roots, as evidence that it was growing. So one of the questions was, is this a seed? And they had predicted that if it was a seed, it would grow. And so there were lots of places to get evidence about their questions. So we have some questions here because we're wondering about whether you in our audience are using drawing and writing in scientific notebooks with kids. And so Bryn, if you could kind of scaffold this since we're phoning it in, we'd appreciate that.
Sure, Deb, and we're right with you so far, so things are going great. Everyone is responding to the poll question that's up on the screen. And folks, if you joined us a little bit late, your poll button is right at the top of the participants window, right under your own name. We've got a lot of people already jumping on this poll question quickly and submitting their answers. If you've typed in the chat window, do also go ahead and select from the poll buttons as well, and we'll get that tabulated in our total here. And in just another moment, I'm going to lock that poll so that we can put up a graph on the whiteboard. And Deb and Jess, I'll let you know the results of that so that you can get some information as well. Okay, everybody, I'm going to lock that poll. I'll put up the graph. And Deb and Jess, it looks like 7 people answered A, not at all. 38 people answered B. 47 answered C, and 79 answered D, and then we had a number of non-responses. But it looks like our majority is there in category D, followed by C, and then B.
That's great. We're really happy about that because we found the notebooks were something that the kids really took ownership of, and that it really enhanced the science conferences for them to bring their data.
And I'm sure, too, those of you that have been using them, I found like that piece of engagement. I had several very reluctant writers during our writers' workshop time, but if it was with that science notebook, it was a different story. So I'm glad to see that that's helping and working with a lot of people. The next slide, the one that's titled Analyzing and Interpreting Data, this is the piece where I found, because once we had all of this in place and we had children collecting evidence and data from their personal cup gardens and then also from the class cup garden and through our science talks, I felt like, oh my goodness, we have a lot of evidence here. And trying to think about and going back to that idea of providing some support for the kiddos on how to make sure that they can start to see that. This is what Deb and I had come up with, and I'm not sure if you're able to see what the graph is showing you, but it's taking the different objects, and this time they're labeled A through G, and then there's corn because they knew that that was a piece of corn. And then they would take a look at everybody's cup, and then the shaded section is that student's A or B or C that was growing. So if it's shaded, that means that it was growing in somebody's cup, and if it is not shaded, that particular object wasn't growing in that student's cup. But what happened is because we had done this, of course, they could now start to see that, well, maybe A didn't grow in my cup, but it was growing in somebody else's, so that way they can kind of start to see what was happening with the entire class and be able to pull from all of those different, I guess, pieces of evidence. Mm-hmm. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, this was quite puzzling to kids because I think they had the idea that if it was a seed, it would grow in everybody's cup. And finding out that it grew in some cups and not others just set off this firestorm of questions from the kids about why it was growing in somebody's cup and not in somebody else's cup. And we'll see a bit later the number of ideas that they came up with for why that was happening. I should also point out that they did recognize, because we checked with them about what this means, and they said, well, yeah, all of these things were seeds because some of them grew in somebody's cup, for all of them. So the test that they had set up, that if they were seeds they would grow, actually worked. And it also brought up many, many more questions. And that was what was wonderful about this work that we did together with the kids, is that it was never done. There was always something new. And the kids were so curious and had so many questions and wanted to continue and design new tests and investigations. So we're going to come back to a question from the audience. And Bryn, if you can scaffold this a bit. This is about representations of data, like charts or graphs, because sometimes we think, oh, kindergarten kids can't do that. They can't make charts and graphs. They can't understand what those are. But if you remember what Heidi was talking about, we were investigators too. We wanted to see what would the kids make out of this. So this is a question about whether those kinds of things show up in your classroom.
Thanks, Deb, and folks are already jumping on this poll question and responding to those. Looks like we've got some people who haven't submitted a response yet. It'd be great to find out what you think about this in your own classroom. I know we've got a number of pre-service teachers and others who aren't in the classroom, so I understand that will contribute to our people who may not be able to respond to this. But if you are currently a classroom teacher, it'd be great to get your response on this one. I'll give just another moment before I close this poll so that we can see the aggregate here. And I'll go ahead and lock that and publish our graph up. And for Deb and Jess, it looks like we had 3 people said A, 50 people said B, 62 people said C, and 50 said D. And so it looks like our majority is in the C category, 21% there for C, and B and D are tied with 17%.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Bryn. So in the next slide, we wanted to just show you some of the ideas that kids came up with in trying to understand why the seed was growing in one cup and not in someone else's. And they were actually constructing plausible explanations in their science talk. So you can see that Mike thought maybe if you planted it at a different time, which kind of makes sense. If I planted mine next week and you planted yours today, then probably mine would be growing before yours. Greg was thinking they were in a different place in the tray under the lights. So maybe the lights were different. They were getting different amounts of sunlight. Trina thought maybe different amounts of water. Greg was wondering if you had to push it down a certain amount or not. Bettina has an idea that the soil is the bestest part because that's what they eat. And Mike thought that if the seed drank the water too fast, it would need more water, so maybe that was why the water was making a difference. And we were always looking at these ideas in the context of what is it we're trying to help kids understand. And in this case, kids were starting to construct a continuum, not just that it needed water, but how much water would it need. So it's a much more sophisticated way of thinking about the water that a plant needs. So Jess is going to talk about how we help kids represent these ideas and questions.
Yeah, this was the part that at first, again, being the first time through, I kept thinking, oh my goodness, what are we going to do with all these questions? It's wonderful, but how do we keep on track? So what you're looking at is a way that we started to, during these science talks, start to kind of record. So we would be able to validate everyone's question by whatever they asked, or if it was a statement that they made, we might kind of help scaffold that and turn it into a question that would make sense, like how much water does a seed need to grow? And then we would write that on a Post-it note and stick it up onto our chart. And then what we could do afterwards is we could take a look at the questions that were asked and then kind of decide which ones would best help us get to that next direction that we wanted the kids to go in. So together, Deb and I were able to work on that. And then it would kind of help make sure that we were staying on track as far as what we needed to make sure what kinds of understandings the kids were coming to by the end.
So this next slide is about a scientific practice that we didn't actually expect to emerge from this work with kids, and we were pretty surprised when it did. It's the engaging in argument from evidence. We were asking kids to look a lot at the evidence and tell us what it meant and interpret and analyze it together. And they were listening to other people's arguments and trying to clarify what other people were saying. So this slide about the lima beans being soft and moldy, there were a number of things that went, quote, wrong, unquote, in our investigations. And in that way, they were much more authentic in terms of the science that we were doing than the usual activities that kids do in elementary science that always turn out right, or you always make sure they turn out right. In this particular case, we had put the classic lima bean in the baggie to see if it needed dirt to grow, because that was one of the ideas. And unfortunately, some of the kids were really sure it needed a lot of water. So if water was good, then more water was better. And what we found was we had a number of beans that were moldy and brown and soft and pretty ugly looking. And we turned it back to the kids. Why do we think this is happening? What is it that could be causing this? And you can see a number of the different ideas. The idea that they drank up all the water too fast and needed more. Greg's idea was kind of the opposite. They got too much water and they're dying. Angela came back to they need the dirt because the dirt is the food. Bettina thought, oh, every one of these needs more water because they need a lot of water. And Kevin was thinking again about whether different amounts of water make a difference. So they were starting to focus in on measurement and how much water it would take. In this picture, you can see Rick coming up to the baggies that were on the board where we were having the discussion and pointing out the ones that were green and healthy and had roots and were growing. And if you look down in the left-hand corner, you can see some pathetic little lima beans that were brown and moldy. And in this slide, engaging in argument from evidence, Jessica's going to talk about his reasoning about what was going on here.
And what you can see from, I guess, the transcript up here is that he's using what he's seeing in the baggies, and he's starting to say, I think that this one had too much water, and is pointing to the one that's very moldy. And this one is healthy because it had just the right amount of water, because they look like they're growing, and the others got too much because they're not growing. So his evidence was that because I still see water droplets inside the bag with the moldy bean, and the healthy beans didn't have as much water droplets left over. So he was kind of starting to use what he was seeing as the evidence from the bags to somewhat argue the point that they were getting the right amount of water. The ones that were moldy were overwatered.
So you can see again kids starting to put together a pattern that more water does this, less water does this, and starting to investigate whether that was what was causing the moldy beans. Now, on the other hand, Jake was a person who thought that more water would be better. I do see some water on mine. His bean was moldy, but I still think that's a little bit less. So Jessica says, less than what? Can you find something you think it's less than? And he points to another moldy one, and Jessica says, do you think there's less water up here in yours than down here? Yeah, because it probably drank it too fast, and it's brown, and it got too fast. It drank it too fast. So Jake is doing what any good scientist does. He's pushing things to extremes. I think it needs more water, and mine still has less than that one. So what should we do about that? And we'll come back to that question in a minute because the kids came up with a solution. But right here, we wanted to show you how you can have too much of a good thing So Jessica's going to talk about Bettina's objection to the teacher's evidence.
And I guess that you'll see in this slide when recognizing that the evidence isn't relevant is that we had previously had, based on the investigation that my intern had done, we had some plants that were over on a counter and that we were watering some and not watering others. And at one point, and you're going to need to help me out with this, because again, and you can see where the support is so necessary. You have all these wonderful ideas and trying to keep the kids on track and keep yourself on track on where you wanted them to go. But Bettina is starting to say that we were trying to get her to look at the evidence that we were seeing from the plant that wasn't watered by the windowsill, and she was saying that that one doesn't work because it doesn't have mold on it, and right now we're looking for things with mold on it.
Right.
Was basically her message.
And the one that was overwatered on the windowsill was brown and yellow and smelly, and we thought they would make the connection, but Bettina wasn't buying it. So that's another reason why, boy, when you see these practices start to emerge, they really come back and haunt you in some ways. So this next one, the planning investigations, we turned it back to the kids and asked them, what should we do next? We have two different theories, and how can we find out which one works? So Gerald said, give them all more water, which was Bettina's idea, and watch to see what happens if it grows more. If it needs more water, it will grow more. Rick stuck to his guns and said, no, you need to get a new paper towel and don't put as much water on it. So in this case, we tried out both of those ideas, and we'll come back to that in a moment, because here we're curious about whether science talks and conferences have a place in your classroom. So Bryn, we'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Deb. Everyone, your poll buttons are open once again, and we'd love to find out from you your use of science talks in the classroom for those who are currently teaching. And folks are quickly jumping on this one as well, so I'll give just one more moment here before locking that so we can continue on, and I'll just give Deb and Jess a quick time check right now, maybe shooting for wrapping up in the next 5 minutes or so.
We're going to see that.
Okay,
Great.
and I'll go ahead and lock our responses there, put up our graph, and let you know what people gave us. 5 people responded A. 63 people said B, 43 said C, and 36 said D. So the majority is 22% said B, followed by C and D.
Okay, thank you. All right, and then just to kind of wrap things up, the next one here, what can teachers do? And we had mentioned this earlier, but throughout all of this, one of our obviously main focuses was to make sure that they were starting to connect this, what we were doing, to what scientists do. So you can kind of see in the transcript there where we were starting to say, well, this is exactly what scientists would do in a lab. And we weren't necessarily looking at all of the content. We were looking at getting those scientific practices in place.
Mm-hmm. And the second slide about what teachers can do brings us back to Jessica and I had both read Ready, Set, Science, especially the chapter on talk moves before we started. And I wanted to point out here how Jessica was coming back to Rick at the end of the lesson and summarizing what he had to say and asking him to clarify his thinking again. And this is where he suggests a way to test that. And Jessica summarizes then his idea and what people could do to test it. And in fact, some kids were so convinced that you needed to add lots more water that when they replanted the next day, they put so much water in that it spouted out where the staples were in the baggie, and we had to put the whole thing inside another baggie. So they were really pushing the theories to the limits, and that was a good thing. They got a lot of good information about that. We wanted to end with some writing, actually some talk, that Angela told us after the unit was over. And you can read this as well as we can read it to you, but I wanted to point out while you're reading how she's captured the role of the science talks and sharing ideas and sharing data and putting it all together and then trying to see what's actually happening. And we couldn't have said it better ourselves.
And on the last slide, the lessons that we learned together, I would say that, and since then, would encourage any classroom teacher to continue to pursue this. I learned so much about what kids are capable of doing, and I also learned that it really does take some support to be able to know how to do that and keep it going in the direction that you need it to go in. Go ahead and add something.
Yeah, I think one of the key things that we found was that the kids just blew us away in what they were capable of doing and thinking about and talking and suggesting investigations and analyzing evidence. And I think that the community of learners together made it a safe place to take a risk and share your ideas and theories. And in that safe space, they spontaneously took up a number of these scientific practices. And we want to encourage teachers to do the same. Find a safe place, find a community, work with your friends, listen to children, help them analyze the data, have a science talk with your colleagues about what's happening in your classroom, and refer back to the standards in your curriculum to talk together about how to stay focused and weave a pathway across the curriculum and your classroom. Bryn, we're going to turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Deb, and thank you, Jessica. At this point, we are going to take two questions that the audience has submitted. So Ted is going to pull out two questions for you to respond to, folks. We will also be having a little informal Q&A at the end, so if your question does not get answered, feel free to stick around with us after the evaluation. Over to you, Ted.
Yes, hi. Start off with sort of based on a comment here that was noted here that this whole approach that you're using here is very inquiry-based, and noting that that's great. And I wondered if any of you would like to comment on how the practices are related to inquiry.
I think the practices are the essence of inquiry, both for grown-ups and for children and for teachers. I think we were inquiring into what children could do and what we could do. I think that children were inquiring into how they could work together to figure out how to make new knowledge and to figure out how things work. I certainly think that we're, if you take the National Science Education Standards and the view of inquiry there, we're certainly embedding all of those ideas in the particular practices that we've identified that really work to help kids make new knowledge and to build the practices in a community.
Great. Another question here about some of the more particulars of what you've done here is some folks are curious about, did you think about having control and putting in something that was not a seed and wouldn't grow at all?
Yes, we did. Unfortunately, none of the kids chose any of those items. There were initially some ideas about seeds that they thought were not seeds, but they were pretty good at identifying things that were not seeds and that they thought would not grow. So they actually didn't choose to plant those.
Yeah, we had done, I think one of the things we put in there was a black jelly bean was one of the items, and then a small little pebble. And like Deb said, this particular class were very quick to say, that's not a seed. I know it's not. I will say that after I've doing this with Deb in the following year, I also continued to do that, and I decided to even though they didn't choose that, we still planted it, and they still obviously collected the evidence that it wasn't growing. So then it proved that it was the jelly bean or the pebble.
Yeah.
Great, thanks very much. Well, I'm going to give us a little bit of an overview here, then we'll have a chance for people to fill out their feedback form, and then we'll do a few more questions after that. But want to just start and point off to folks here that the NSTA web homepage has a link in place for learning about the Next Generation Science Standards and resources about that. You can also get to it just directly with nsta.org/ngss. I want to point out also that we have a discussion forum, our community forum, specifically focused on the Next Generation Science Standards. You can continue this conversation you've been having here tonight in the chat in that area. We've been talking obviously a lot about the framework, and encourage you to take a look at that. Also, NSTA has a reader's guide to the framework, which may be helpful to you in looking at those. We've also, in NSTA's journals, been having a number of articles about the framework and the standards and the different practices there. And so for those of you who are read Science in Children, since we're focused at the elementary level, I would encourage you to look at the articles there. We'll have a lot about the framework and the standards coming up in San Antonio, April 11th through 12th. I like to say it's the place to be to learn about NGSS. And we will be 2 weeks from today having another one of these series pieces here about the practices. This one will be Sarah Michaels. Some of you were talking about Ready, Set, Science. Sarah Michaels was one of the co-authors, I think, with Heidi. I don't remember if there are other authors there as well. But she'll be talking about the connections between the practices in NGSS, Common Core Math, and Common Core English Language Arts. So I think a lot of you may be interested in that as well. And then we'll be moving on into looking at the cross-cutting concepts in NGSS with the pieces in place here. I will point out and say that I'm sorry that we don't have the registration up for this set of web seminars. You can register for the one 2 weeks from now on the practices. But these will be coming up very soon. I, like many of you, have been very tied up the last week looking at the draft of NGSS and getting ready to work on NSTA feedback on that. And as soon as that's done, I'm going to have descriptions of all of those put up for you all. And with that, I'll turn things back to Bryn and just thank Heidi, Deb, and Jessica for the great information they gave today.
Thank you, Ted, and I would like to echo your appreciation for our feature presenters, for Heidi, for Deb, and for Jessica for the fantastic information tonight. It was wonderful to see so many practical ideas for the classroom. And Ted, I'd also like to thank you as well for your continued information on NGSS. We would like to thank the sponsor of today's web seminar, the Carnegie Corporation of New York. And a thank you to the administration of NSTA for their support for web seminars. And here is a look at our upcoming web seminar calendar. You can join us tomorrow for one in our NASA Explorer Schools series. We'll be looking at algebraic equations, transit tracks, finding habitable planets. On January the 31st, you can learn more about the NSTA Learning Center, our online portal with free resources for you science educators. And then next Monday on February the 4th, Science Instructional Leadership in an Era of New Standards. You can register for these programs and more on our upcoming calendar by going to learningcenter.nsta.org/webseminars. I'd like to thank everyone for your participation and look forward to seeing you again on another web seminar.